Hello everyone. In today's tutorial, we will be making a custom shift lock system and a target lock-on system that you can see in the video right now. To get started, we'll change some settings on the starter player object. You can follow what I do for the exact results, but if your game requires something else, feel free to change these. Do beware though, straying from my settings will mean that some features of the system might not work as expected, so you'll have to adapt them to your needs. After that, we add a new local script to our starter player scripts folder. Name it Input Controller. Inside the script, add a folder and call it Events. Add another folder and name it Key Codes. We add an event to the Events folder and a string value to the Key Codes folder. We name them Camera Lock Event and Key Code respectively. Inside the script, we first define User Input Service. After that, we need references to the Camera Lock event and the Camera Lock key code. Then we make a function that will listen to input began. Connect that function as a listener to the input began event inside our start function. We first check if the input was game processed. Make a conditional statement to see if the user used their keyboard. Then we'll cache the input key code as a string like this. Now we can compare the input string to our assigned camera lock key code. And if they're the same, we call fire on the camera lock event. We're done with this script for now. Let's create a new one and we'll call it Camera Controller. This will control our custom shift lock. First, we'll get a reference to that camera lock input event. And then we'll add a runtime variable to track if our camera lock is enabled. We'll define a function that will track our camera lock key presses. Bind that function to the event in the start function. Back inside this function, we'll just invert the camera lock-enabled boolean on input. Next, we need a reference to user input service. And back inside the function, with user input service, we can change the mouse behavior with a ternary conditional operator. We can also toggle the mouse icon off when camera lock is enabled, using the inverse bool. Alright, with that, we can do a quick test to see if our camera lock is working. Assign a key that you'd like to use for the camera lock inside this key code value. I'll go with Q. Let's start the game. And if I press Q, you can see my mouse becomes invisible and the camera is locked. While testing, we can grab something we need. The player module, you can find it under the player object. We'll be modifying the base camera module, but we need the whole player module to do that. So just copy it, stop the test, and back in our starter player scripts folder, we can paste the player module. Now let's open up the base camera module. Inside, we have to change these two head offset values. The Y value of these vectors determines how high the camera is offset for the player. So as you can see, the camera perspective is a bit higher now, and I'm happy with that. Next, I'd like a crosshair when I enable camera lock. So I'll make a new screen GUI object in the starter GUI folder. Call it HUD GUI. And make sure to set reset on spawn to false. Inside the GUI, I'll add a new image label. Call it crosshair. I don't mind if it's just a tiny square in the middle. You can do whatever you want here. Now we'll create a new folder and a new event inside the camera controller script, and I'll name the event Camera Lock Changed. With this, we can have a callback to whenever our camera lock is toggled on or off without relying on the input event. So just open up our camera controller, add a reference to that event, and fire it with the parameter being the camera lock enabled bool. Next, we need a new script that's going to control our HUD GUI, so name it HUD Controller. Inside it, we'll first get a reference to our player, and that event we just made in the camera controller. We'll also create a function that's going to bind to that event, with a bool parameter telling us if the camera lock is enabled. Bind that function to the event in the start function. And inside the function, we'll attempt to get a reference to our crosshair image. After a null check, we'll toggle the visibility based on the camera lock enabled bool. We also want to make sure the crosshair isn't visible at the start of the game. Alright, we've got the custom shift lock done, so now we'll do the target lock logic. First, we need a new input event and key code. We call them target lock event and key code respectively. Assign the key code to what you'd like. I'll go with E. Let's now get references to that key code and event inside the input controller. And in the input began function, we'll add an else if statement and check if the key pressed was the target lock key, and if it is, just fire the target lock event. Now we need a little helper script. This thing will help us track our character status. We'll call it Player Character Controller. Inside it, we need a folder called Events, and in that folder, 2 events. One event fires when our player has spawned a character, and the other when our character has died. Create references to these events inside the script. We'll need a cached callback to our humanoid death. Default it to nil. Then we need 2 functions. One of them processes the death of our humanoid, and the other fires when we have a new character spawn. The other method has a parameter of new character. We'll bind the second function inside a function called lateStart. This just means that the function runs delayed by a certain amount of time, as you can see by the wait statement. I'll explain why we use lateStart in a second. Before that, we'll get a reference to our player. And on the player character added event, we'll bind the onCharacter spawned method. Then we just fire the spawn event with the character as our event parameter. After that, we have to find our character's humanoid, do a null check on it, and bind the death function to the humanoid died event. We also cache this bind as the character death callback. Once the humanoid dies, inside the death function, we'll just fire the death event, but we also have to make a disconnect on our character death callback. Now back to lateStart. The reason we want to delay it is because sometimes at the launch of the game, this character added callback won't fire because the player's character already exists due to race conditions. All we have to do to fix this issue is do a check before the character added bind. Check if the player already has a character, and if he does, we just call the spawn function with our player's character as the parameter. There we go. Now we have a clean way of determining when our character dies and when a new character has spawned. Alright, now we can create the target lock controller script. Inside the script, we'll add a new folder and call it data. We need two vector3 values. These are the camera offset and the target offset for our lock-on system. You can leave the values as default for now. Lastly, we need a number value that's going to determine how close we have to be to an enemy to engage the lock-on. I'll just set it to 1000 for now. Now in the script, we'll define a few methods first. First, we need a way to disable and enable the target lock. After that, we'll need a way to know whether our target lock input was pressed. We'll also need a start function. Then we'll add references to our camera lock changed event. Make sure this is the one inside the camera controller. And we need our target lock input event. I forgot to create a function that's going to process our camera lock change, so I'll do that now. Remember that it has a bool parameter. Now inside our start function, we'll bind these two events to their respective callbacks. We also need two variables that'll track if the camera lock is enabled and if the target lock is enabled. In the camera lock change function, we'll set our camera lock enabled value to be whatever the parameter value is. And if our camera lock isn't enabled, then we have to disable the target lock. Now in the target lock input callback, we'll do a preemptive check on our camera lock enabled value. If it's not true, then we just exit out the method. If it's enabled, we can toggle between disabling or enabling our target lock based on our target lock enabled value. Inside the enable and disable target lock functions, we'll set the values respectively. After that, we need a reference to our player character spawn and death events. We'll create two functions to act as listeners to these events. Inside the death function, we'll just call disable target lock. And also keep in mind the spawn event has a parameter that's our new character. And we'll just bind them inside the start function. To manipulate the camera, I'll be using the update function, so create a reference to the run service and bind a function to the heartbeat event with a delta time parameter inside the start function. Now we need variables to track our own character and the targeted character, so just define those. We'll need the character, humanoid, and humanoid root part for each. First, we'll make sure to set our player character variables to nil inside the character death function. Then we'll cache those same variables inside our character spawn function. We'll need a reference to the current camera. After that, inside our enable target lock function, we can do a few checks just to make sure we can enable the target lock. If we pass those checks, we can do a raycast from our camera's position toward its look vector multiplied by that minimum distance value we created earlier, so make a reference to that as well. Now we do a few checks, just to make sure we actually hit something with the raycast. We also have to make sure that whatever we hit isn't a descendant of our own player character. Then we do checks on whether the part we hit is a model that's a humanoid character, and we cache all the things we need to proceed. After all those checks, we know that we hit a humanoid that's not us and isn't dead, so we can cache those parts as our target. Now we'll go back into the disable target lock function and clear all those same variables when the target lock is disabled. We also have to set the camera type to custom, which is the default Roblox setting once we disable target lock. And inside enable target lock, we have to set the camera type to scriptable since we'll be manipulating it when we have a target. We'll create references to our target lock vector 3 offset values. Now we go inside the update function. First we'll check if our target lock is enabled. We have our own character's humanoid root part, and we have a target humanoid root part. We add an else if statement. This checks if we have a target and target lock is enabled, but their health is lower than 0. And if it is, they died, so we just disable target lock. Inside the first if statement, we'll define a few positions. First, we need the target position of our camera, which is our player's character humanoid root part position, offset by our target camera offset Y value. Then we need the position we want our camera to look at, which is the target's humanoid root part, offset by our target lock target offset value. Next, we need the forward linear offset, which will just be the inverse of our camera look vector, multiplied by the Z value in our camera offset value. Lastly, we need the right linear offset, which is our camera right vector multiplied by the X value. Then we just set the C-frame with our positions and our look vector target. I'll quickly copy my character, change its animate to a server script so we can test the target lock. Now we can do a test. If I enable camera lock with Q and aim at the character and press E, the target lock is enabled. The camera's following the character, but it's got weird positioning, so let's fix that. If we leave the target lock enabled and open our players folder and find our player, inside the player scripts we can find the target lock controller. In the data folder, we can change the vector 3 offset values to get our desired look. Remember those values or write them down somewhere and stop the test. Now I'll just change the values inside my starter player to those values. And we can see now it works perfectly. Last thing I'd like to add, and this step is optional, is the highlights. So back in our target lock controller script, let's go inside the enable target lock function. At the end of it, we'll attempt to find the target lock highlight object. In case it doesn't already exist, we'll just make a new one like this. After our if statement, we just set the target highlight to enabled. And inside the disable target lock function, we'll have to disable that highlight. First, we'll check if the target character exists. Then we attempt to find the highlight by the exact name. And if it exists, we just disable it. We do a quick test and we can see everything works now. I plan on expanding upon this tutorial to make an action combat system tutorial series, so stay tuned. And that's it for this tutorial. If you found it helpful, please consider subscribing or liking the video. Thanks for watching.